So, one of the programs that Nixon waded into that was connected to earlier presidents like Johnson was on the issue of welfare. Remember, Johnson had embraced an expanded vision of welfare as part of his war on poverty, instituting programs like the food stamp program for people who had food security issues, or the Head Start program to try to promote education to poorer populations. And we're going to see Nixon very much concerned with how to make these programs more functional. For example, he will expand the food stamp program, and Nixon will be the first president to formally index Social Security benefits to inflation. What this means in plain English is if inflation goes up, your benefits go up to match it. So, in other words, this is preserving the buying power of the benefits you get rather than have your dollar amount remain the same as inflation goes up and therefore you have less buying power. So, Nixon was trying to maintain the same level of buying power regardless of the fluctuation of the American dollar. Where Nixon's really going to start to kick a hornet's nest, however, is when he proposes a change to a New Deal program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC. So Nixon proposes these changes pretty early on in his first year in 1969. So, what is this program and how does it work, and why did Nixon want to mess with it? So, originally, the AFDC was a New Deal program which gave government payments to low income families with children who had lost their primary breadwinner. So think of this as kind of like widows and orphans, right? The traditional recipients or acceptable recipients of charity in American history. Now, initially, more people making claims under this program starting in the 1930s were poor white families. But by 1970, half of the recipients were Black due to this disparity in the poverty rate, okay, and in these communities that experience poverty. The other change to this program was the number of families led by single mothers had grown. So, in other words, a program that was originally interpreted to be for widows and orphans was increasingly being for single mothers with children. And this is partly reflecting a increased demographic of more and more households being led by women, more children being born out of wedlock. But this did draw a lot of ire from conservatives because they interpreted single mothers with kids getting this kind of government benefits as trying to milk the government. So this is where the idea of the welfare queen comes into political consciousness. This idea of like women popping out kids just on their own out of wedlock just so that they can take advantage of this government handout. This is where that starts to come in. Now, Nixon is not so much concerned about passing value judgments on this. His concern was more, how do we make this program simpler to administer? Okay, we're not going to cut it all together, but we do want to shrink the size of government to streamline the bureaucracy. So Nixon proposed, instead of this program where they had to kind of determine who was eligible and how much they got, to instead propose a minimum income to every low income family. So he called this the Family Assistance Program, or the unfortunate acronym of FAP. And the idea was that each low income family would receive a flat stipend of $1,600 a year. If you're wondering what that is about today, it's about 10,000-ish dollars. So in other words, this is not enough for a family to live on, certainly today, but it is not nothing either. And Nixon argued that this would help by minimizing the bureaucracy necessary to process that by just simply giving a flat income to anybody who met this basic criteria of being low income and having dependent children. However, the Republican Party thought that this was too radical because you know what this is, right? This is basically the idea of a universal basic income, right? We're still having a conversation about this today, especially in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, this idea of everybody, in order to achieve a basic standard of living, getting a stipend, right? A basic stipend, regardless of their employment status. This is basically a version of a universal basic income. Democrats and more liberal politicians saw Nixon's proposals not going far enough. They argued this is not realistically going to be enough to live on for a family, whereas Republicans and more social conservatives identified this as, again, government handouts. And so Nixon got fire from both sides of the aisle on this, and Nixon's proposed revisions to the welfare program never actually go through because they were not seen as going far enough for the Democrats, and they were seen as way too much by the Republican Party. Nixon's time in office is also going to be marked by the arrival of a new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger. So Warren Burger is going to take the court in a more progressive direction. So Burger, for example, will be the Chief Justice in the 1973 Roe v. Wade case, which we'll talk more about next time. But we're going to see the Burger Court have to tackle a wide variety of issues. Warren Burger was nominated by Lyndon Johnson, and in an election year, he was nominated in 1968. And what was interesting was he was not Johnson's first choice. So Johnson had initially nominated a judge named Abe Fortas for the Supreme Court Chief Justice position. However, many Republicans did not approve of Fortas because of what they perceived as judicial activism by the previous Chief Justice, Earl Warren, in cases like Griswold v. Connecticut, for example. And so they rejected Fortas and instead went with Burger because they felt that he was a safer choice, that he would be more conservative. And surprisingly, Burger continues much of the trends of the Warren Court, if at a slower pace. So, two of the hot topics that come up about race in the Burger Court in the 1970s is the issue of school segregation and busing. Despite the fact that the 1954 case, Brown v. Board of Education, outlawed school segregation, by 1968, the rate of Black children attending integrated schools was only 32%. Part of this was due to Southern states dragging their feet over implementing integration, and there were a series of follow-up court rulings where courts, tired over this delay and this foot dragging, pushed integration, with the result that by 1971, the rate of integration in Southern schools climbed to about 77%. But there was a question of how realistically many of these places could integrate, because the school that your child attends is largely determined by where you live, right? It's residentially zoned. And because many neighborhoods were racially segregated still, people didn't want to live in diverse neighborhoods. How do you get a school that is diverse if you're drawing from a non-diverse neighborhood? And so, to comply with this integration order, some school districts decided that they were going to adopt what they call busing. So, in other words, taking children from one school district or one neighborhood and transferring them to more distant schools. So, mixing up forcibly through busing kids to farther away schools, mixing up the population. And there was an issue over whether this was particularly acceptable to be able to do. And the Supreme Court heard a series of cases on the issue of integration and in particular busing. In 1971, the case Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education was a unanimous decision that said that the strategy of busing to achieve integration was perfectly legal. However, many parents were upset with this decision, arguing that it was difficult for the kids to be bused to these farther schools. Many of these parents also opposed integration. They argued that this ruined the local nature of the schools by sending these kids to schools outside of their neighborhoods. And there was also the question of how much local control over schools was there, because in the case of Charlotte Mecklenburg, this was a decision that had been made at the county level, not necessarily the local level. The Supreme Court held a hearing on a case out of Texas about funding for schools, which was another hot button issue. Traditionally in the United States, funding for your schools comes from property taxes. So in other words, that means if you live in a wealthier or more affluent area where people have nicer quality property that's valued more, you have more tax revenue than you do if you live in, say, a poor area. So what was happening was that inner cities, which were increasingly poor and full of non-white folk, had lower property values, thus less taxes and less school funding than the more affluent, whiter suburbs. San Antonio ISD versus Rodriguez, which was the case heard in 1973, questioned the legality of using property taxes because the result was very uneven funding. The Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that using property taxes to fund schools was not wrong. They argued there was nothing in the Constitution that required equity in school funding. So in other words, you could not compel say, a suburban school district to revenue share with an urban school district to even out funding and resources. So the Supreme Court said, we recognize this is a problem, but the Constitution doesn't really say that it's, illegal or unconstitutional. Lastly, the last case about schools that the Supreme Court heard in the 1970s was Milliken v. Bradley, which specifically said, again, on the issue of school district cooperation, that suburban districts did not have to assist in integration with urban districts. Again, you could adopt the idea of busing, but within school districts. So this said, if you have neighboring school districts that want to cooperate with each other and want to adopt busing to integrate a population, fine, but you cannot compel another school district to work with you on the issue of busing and integration. So because of these cases that the Supreme Court heard, we still see today schools tending to be segregated by race or class because they're still zoned by residents and they're still getting funding based on property taxes. Now, you do have some school districts that have embraced the idea of open enrollment, which is very popular in El Paso, right? That you can go to a school even if you don't live in that district, but there are still some logistical challenges to that. The other hot button issue involving race in the 1970s before the Burger Court was the issue of affirmative action. So affirmative action was a program meant to give a boost to minorities in education or employment by allowing entities to use race or gender as a deciding factor when choosing between two otherwise equally qualified candidates. So what this means is if you're looking at two fairly identical resumes with much the same education level and experience, then at that point you could say both of these guys are qualified, I could hire either one. At that point, you're allowed to give the edge to the minority candidate. The idea being that this would again help boost diversity in education and hiring. For example, the federal government tried to implement an idea called the Philadelphia Plan, in which they said if you were a construction contractor working with a federal contract, you had to hire a certain number of minority workers. And Nixon believed that this plan would allow him to appear progressive, but also break the power of these construction unions. because many trade unions said, that's great, that's a great idea. We just don't have very many non-white tradesmen in the pipeline to be able to meet this quota that you're proposing. Nixon abandoned the plan in his re-election campaign in 1972, hoping to win the votes of blue-collar workers, and instead shifted to a strategy of encouraging unions to voluntarily diversify their workforce. Many white people argued that affirmative action was a form of reverse discrimination, that this was racism against white people. And so there were many challenges to this process of affirmative action. The Supreme Court heard a number of cases in the 1970s over affirmative action and did draw out some basic guidelines for how it should work. In the 1971 case of Griggs versus Duke Power Company, they said that any hiring policy that had the effect of excluding large groups were not permitted. So, for example, many companies would give written tests as part of their application process with, for example, vocabulary that would be sort of out of the reach for, say, working class people in an attempt to self-select. And they said you can't give any kind of requirement in your hiring process that's not immediately related to your job task, because that's a blatant attempt to further restrict the kinds of people who qualify for your job. In 1979, the Supreme Court heard a case called United Steelworkers of America v. Weber, and this was about whether Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation and its union could set quotas for hiring minority workers. The Supreme Court said the idea of quotas, so the idea of having to hire a certain number of people, was perfectly acceptable in this case because it was a voluntary agreement between two private parties. In this case, the company, Kaiser Aluminum and Chemical Corporation, and its union. And therefore, because it was a voluntary agreement between two private entities, it could not violate the 14th Amendment. However, if it was a government entity, it's different. So the Supreme Court heard a case, Regents of the University of California v. Bakke in 1978, which was about the University of California's policy of holding aside a certain number of spots in its medical school admission for minorities. The Supreme Court said you could not do that. You could not have a quota or a certain number of spots reserved on the basis of race, because in this case, the University of California is a government entity. They said that it was perfectly acceptable to use race as one of many factors in deciding admission, but you could not earmark a set number of spots or places based on race. So again, you can use affirmative action as a deciding factor, right, of one of many factors among equal candidates, but you cannot say we will reserve X number of places for students of different races. So the 1970s continues to see a number of social changes in the United States, in particular, an increasing sexual revolution, so the legacy of the 1960s. No longer do we have the trend of people getting married in their early 20s and then staying married. By the time we get to the 1970s, we see an increasing number of Americans waiting until later to get married. Today, the average age of marriage for couples is in late 20s and early 30s. We also see an increasing rate of divorce. In 1975, 1 million Americans divorced, which was double the number in 1965. And as a result of some of these changes in culture and increasing access to birth control and legal abortion after 1973, the birth rate goes down. So where the birth rate had been the highest during the birth of the baby boom generation between 1945 and 1965, when the average American family was having 3.2 children, in 1976, when we're smack dab in the middle of what we call Generation X, the average number of children born to American families was 1.7, which is actually below what we call population replacement numbers. So the idea is if you want your population to remain stable, each couple should have 2 kids, right, to replace them. So if you have less than 2 kids, then the idea is your population may eventually shrink. Women are getting increasing opportunities in education and the workforce in the 1970s, particularly with the passage of Title IX in 1972. Title IX banned sexual discrimination in higher education and required gender equity in all areas of higher education, including college sports. Title IX today protects all Americans regardless of sex, gender orientation, sexual identity, immigrant status, etc., but it was originally passed to address discrimination against women in higher education. And it worked very well. Today, as of 2020, women now make up more than half of all college graduates and more than half of all holders of advanced degrees. Women are also making increasing gains in the workforce. When we look at the number of young mothers in the workforce, traditionally before World War II, if you were a young mother, you were generally not in the workforce unless you had to be because you were working class. But if we look at the percentage of young mothers in the workforce after World War II, in 1960, there were about 20% of young mothers in the workforce. 1980, it's gone up to 40%. 1990, 55%. Many women continued to work, some out of economic necessity after having kids, some because they wanted to. Many women had the opportunity to pursue careers that were previously closed to them, and other women had to go to work to support their families as the economy begins to crumble in the mid-1970s, which we'll talk more about next time. There's also an increasing visibility of the LGBTQ community. They gain increasing presence in the 1970s following the rebirth of the LGBTQ rights movement after Stonewall in 1969. The community is focused on decriminalizing same-sex sex and passing anti-discrimination laws. And this is the decade where you have, for example, more and more people coming out, as the parlance said, to live openly. And this is also the time period in the early 1970s where same-sex attraction is removed as a type of mental illness. And so the increasing visibility and prominence of LGBTQ individuals in mainstream society in the 70s did alarm conservatives, and is part of this conservative backlash to social changes in the 60s and 70s that we'll talk more about next time. The 1970s earns the nickname the Me Decade. If rejection of the mainstream conformity marked the 1960s, a commitment to self-discovery marks the 1970s. So there's emphasis on personal growth. This nickname of the Me Decade is coined by writer Tom Wolfe, who described that decade as Americans focusing on themselves and their own self-improvement. So fitness trends become very popular during the 1970s. The explosion of the health food market, eating organic and clean, a lot of health food chains owe their beginnings to the 1970s. More and more Americans accepting the notion of therapy, right? That you don't just go to therapy if you've been through severe trauma, but you can also do that for your own personal health and wellness. This all becomes more popular in the 1970s as well.